The reopening is in full swing. But yeah, I guess the big question is how much longer can we take these higher prices? And let's not forget that inflation is high and it hurts very vulnerable households, over 30%. I have to take this high inflation in the chin. The sad thing is holidays na, diba? So my feel is that people will continue to spend kahit kasi first Christmas after 2 years, diba? So kahit nahirapan, baka umutang sila just to make it work.
From the nation's capital, all sides, all the time, I'm Edlin Gao.
And I'm Danny Laurel. The big story tonight.
The country's economy grew at a faster rate in the third quarter, even in the face of soaring inflation.
Now, economists attributed the expansion to revenge spending following 2 years of lockdowns due to the pandemic. Mobile journalist Pamela Vasquez has the big story.
The Philippine economy grew much faster than expected in the third quarter of 2022. GDP came in at 7.6%, beating most forecasts by a mile. The data showed that Filipinos continue to spend big, even in the face of high inflation.
We are on track to achieving the government's growth target of 6.5 to 7.5. This turnout signifies that Filipino families are close to returning to pre-pandemic life, as more people visit restaurants and hotels and engage in recreational activities within the country.
Data from the Statistics Agency show most sectors sustained growth, with household consumption leading the way. Balisacan said the resumption of face-to-face classes also boosted growth. Agriculture also grew 2.2%, though that doesn't yet include the impact of typhoons Carding and Paeng. Here in Divisoria, a place known for bargain hunting, people have begun shopping for Christmas as they always do this time of the year.
2 taon, wala namang Pasko. Siyempre, excited yung mga bata para mamasko ulit. Kung sa may mga kayang bumili, okay lang naman. Sa mga wala, yun nga, sabi mo, mahal. Maraming nagsitaas, lalos lahat talaga nagsitaasan ng presyo.
Economists say revenge spending will continue to prop up the economy in the next few quarters.
Basically just saying, we don't know when we're going to have the chance to do this anymore, given the events of 2020. So spend now, invest now. The reopening is in full swing. But yeah, I guess the big question is how much longer can we take these higher prices?
But he is also getting worried about what this means for Filipino savings, especially with the prospect of a global recession next year.
One thing that we're looking at is that savings, people have been dipping into their savings and they're not able to build them up again.
Meanwhile, the government says it will continue to combat inflation by providing cash transfers, fuel discounts, and other forms of targeted assistance to vulnerable sectors. Mobile journalist Pamela Vasquez, we are One News.
And here to talk to us about the country's 7.6% GDP growth in the third quarter, we have with us live via Zoom Sir Percival Peña-Reyes, Director of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. Sir, magandang gabi and welcome to the big story.
Good evening, magandang gabi sa inyong lahat at sa ating mga tagapanood.
Yes, sir. Thank you for joining us. Sir, of course, better than expected numbers. Big question is, can a country sustain this growth given the current inflation situation and given the possibility of even higher inflation rates by December?
Yes, well, in fact, we submitted a forecast also, 7.7%, higher, of course, than the median, which was 6.1. Highest, but turned out to be the closest, I'm proud to say. And we feel also that the growth target of 6.5 to 7.5% is achievable. In fact, we see that for the whole year, we might even exceed it a bit. Our view is about 7.6%. Of course, if we are able to manage, of course, as you have mentioned, inflation, because it's still, of course, in a cautionary state, but not just here. We're also seeing it happening elsewhere in the world. But on the upside, we're seeing an positive indication in terms of employment. Unemployment seems to be on the recovery side. And my colleagues and I, in our pronouncements and also in our briefings, we are quite optimistic in the sense that we seem to be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel already. But of course, we have to monitor closely what's happening to the dollar and, of course, the price of oil.
Prof, most of this now was consumption-driven and from revenge spending. People are dipping into the savings that they had that they weren't able to spend. First question, how long is this revenge spending going to be happening? And what about our fundamental areas of growth, industrial output, exports? What do you make of that, sir?
Well, for revenge spending, yes, I see that. Even anecdotally, if you look at traffic right now, it's surprisingly, you see a lot of traffic, even if fuel prices have gone up. Okay, but in terms of consumption and investment, we see that it could still further accelerate before reverting to normalcy. Now, your question about how long this could last, of course, savings is primary concern. There might be a risk also of depleting them, since we we're not yet sure how much how far we can sustain this. But of course, we have to also perhaps look outward and channel our energies really more into exports and FDIs. Okay? We see depreciation happening, but on the upside, it could benefit the export sector, tourism, import competing industries, remittances, beneficiaries of OFW remittances, and workers in new or expanding foreign firms that find investing cheaper. So that's FDI. But of course, we have a limitation in terms of our domestic market. We also need to look outward. And not everybody would enjoy the benefit of having that cushion in terms of dollar earnings. Okay? So inflation does not discriminate. And when it hits us, it hits everyone. But those who have the benefit of cushion from dollar earnings would not feel the blow as much as those who do not have such benefit. That's why really we have to look more outward in terms of channeling our growth and push more the export sector and FDI.
Sir, let me take a stab here. I will not pretend to be an expert in the economy, so help me out here. It's basically growth based on increased spending. However, hindi ba chicken and the egg din to? Kasi spending can also drive up inflation further. And in the end, is it possible that the higher inflation because of that will also temper spending?
Yes, that's a good question, sir. Because what we're seeing really right now, it's inflation that is more induced by the supply side. It's externally driven. Okay? But of course, we would want to prop up demand. Okay? Because the thing here is you need to outgrow your inflation.
Yeah.
Okay? So if your GDP is growing by 7.6%, that's good. But as I mentioned, inflation is still in a cautionary state. Okay? If your inflation is the latest figure, if I recall, 7.7%, okay? We have to, of course, manage that. Okay? The key really here is, of course, is to outgrow the inflation. And also,
outpace the inflation,
on the fiscal side, on the side of public finance, we also have to manage our finances well, because like what was mentioned earlier, we could do subsidies, but we have to be very prudent in using those subsidies. We have to target them properly to the most vulnerable sectors of the population.
Okay, thank you so much for that input. That was, of course, Sir Percival Peña-Reyes, Director of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. Thank you, sir. Now, when we return, we will be joined by Richard Heydarian, Senior Lecturer at the Asian Center of the University of the Philippines, to discuss the United States' 2022 midterm elections. That and more when the big story returns. Keep it here on One News. You're watching the big story here on One News. Now, President Bongbong Marcos wraps up his first day in Cambodia with several bilateral talks with ASEAN heads of state and business leaders. Mean Los Baños is joining us from Phnom Penh to give us the latest. Mean, what do you have for us?
Danny, good evening. President Ferdinand Marcos started his day with the roundtable meeting with CEOs and Cambodian business leaders, after which he discussed a myriad of things with Vietnamese Prime Minister PM Minh Chinh. This afternoon, President Marcos met with Vietnamese Prime Minister PM Minh Chinh, where they agreed to further strengthen their partnership on areas of defense, trade, investment, agriculture, and maritime security. Foreign Affairs Assistant Secretary Nathaniel Imperial said the president emphasized the need for strong partnerships to address security issues.
There was no specific discussion of the code of conduct, but they both agreed that we should have closer bilateral relations. The closer bilateral relations is a prerequisite for addressing these regional and bilateral issues.
The president also mentioned the need for ASEAN to find a common ground in dealing with pressing concerns, which include the rising tensions between China and Taiwan, as well as resolving the crisis in Myanmar.
He mentioned that one of the key topics under discussion in the summits, the ASEAN summits, is Myanmar, and as well as the situation in the Taiwan Straits and the Korean Peninsula, as well as Ukraine and its impact on the Southeast Asian economies.
Marcos also said he looks at Vietnam as an important partner in ensuring food security, as the latter accounts for 90% of the Philippines' rice imports. Aside from this, the chief executive accepted the invitation of the Vietnamese PM for a state visit. Danny, tonight the president is expected to have a bilateral meeting with Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen, and on Sunday, November 13, he will have a one-on-one meeting with the leaders of South Korea and Brunei. According to the DFA, there will be no bilateral talks between PBBM and Chinese President Xi Jinping, as the latter will not attend the ASEAN summit. Danny?
Thanks so much for that update. That was Mean Los Baños reporting to us live from Phnom Penh in Cambodia.
The race for both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate are winding up, as majority of the seats up for election have been called. In the House, where all 435 seats are up for grabs, 391 have been called. As of 6:30 p.m. today, 184 of those are won by Democrats, while 207 were snagged by Republicans. As of now, votes are still being counted to decide on some states, including California, Arizona, and Montana. The race is tighter over at the Senate, with 35 seats up for election. You're looking at the current balance of power in the upper chamber, where Democrats hold 48 seats, while Democrats hold 48 seats, while Republicans hold 49. In total, there should be 100 senators, 2 for each state. The initial results are the opposite of the so-called red wave that the Republicans were expecting in this year's midterms. While Republicans were predicted to seize control of the House, they are currently doing so by narrower margins than expected. Exit polls with analysts and voters showed that the issue of protecting abortion rights was nearly as paramount as inflation. Voters apparently are also concerned of the Republican Party's continued embrace of former President Donald Trump, which has also trumped the party's hopes for a red wave. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden said that Election Day was a good day for democracy, but the results showed that Americans are still frustrated.
It was a good day, I think, for democracy. And I think it was a good day for America, regardless of what the final tally in these elections show, and there's still some counting going on. I'm prepared to work with my Republican colleagues. The American people have made clear, I think, that they expect Republicans to be prepared to work with me as well.
Now, to discuss the U.S. midterm elections further, we have with us in studio University of the Philippines Asian Center Senior Lecturer Richard Heydarian joining us live. Hello, Richard, and good evening. Now,
Pleasure.
Jumping right into why should we care about this U.S. midterm elections? What are the implications of the results for our economy?
Well, I mean, in the same way that we may not care about the United States, but what happens in the United States has impact all across the world. They still have the biggest economy in the world. Some projections would say up until 2060, America may maintain its status as the biggest economy in the world. But more importantly, what happens with their financial decisions, especially the Fed rate hikes, that's going to have impact on exchange rates in the Philippines. And not to mention, of course, the United States is our only treaty ally. No? So mahalaga yung maging foreign policy position ng United States. And in addition to that, of course, America is supposed to be the beacon of democracy. So if American democracy is embroiled in crisis, it will have ripple effects across the world. And President Biden has made democracy promotion a center of his foreign policy agenda. So how he performs domestically, right, affects how he projects power internationally and supports democracies all across the world. That's why, whether you're not a fan of the United States or not, doesn't matter. But what happens in the United States will affect us in one way or another, economically, politically, and geopolitically. Yeah.
But the red tide did not happen as expected. I mean, we still see the Republicans taking over the House of Representatives. Pero it's not as big as expected. Some would see that as parang a good sign, but some would also see it as a bad sign. More acrimony and more debates, more stalemates in both chambers, and therefore more difficulty in governing that country.
Right. I mean, in the United States, it's usually the opposite of the Philippines when it comes to midterm elections. They're anti-incumbency, right? Because American people try to create some sort of balance. When all branches of the government are within the grasp of one party, there tends to be a little bit of discomfort about that. But this year is absolutely, different, right? Because we have the situation with the Roe versus Wade, concerns about abortion rights, and at the same time, you have the inflation crisis. So what happened was that there was no red wave because each state had its own dynamics. So in states where abortion rights and democracy were a primary issue, places like Michigan, for instance, the Democrats did extremely well, right? And even in Pennsylvania, they were able to, flip essentially the state from the Republican to the Democrat. But in other states, like Florida, for instance, where inflation, economics, cultural wars were much more important, right? Then the Republicans did better. So I think the polls were expecting kind of a more or less similar picture across the country, but what happened is that internal state dynamics shape how Democrats and Republicans perform. Now, the implications are still going to be national because Trump was counting on a red wave to announce his presidential run in 2024 more or less today or yesterday.
But I'm sure he's still going to run.
But it's not happening. He's still going to run, but we don't know if the wins are going to be in the sales.
Show for this competition between Trump and Biden in 2024?
And my sense is Biden is now in a better position to say, I'm going to run for re-election, right? Because it's still a big secret whether Biden will run or not, right? I think he wants to, and I think this result will give him that kind of momentum. Now, Trump may have some issues because you have DeSantis and other rivals saying, well, a lot of Trump-endorsed guys, the extreme guys, didn't do well in a lot of states. That's why we're not seeing the red wave. And by the way, we won't know who's going to control the Senate up until next month because there's going to be runoff elections in Georgia unless both Nevada and Arizona go to the Democrats, which I think is unlikely. In the Congress, it might still take weeks before we know what's going to be the final showdown. So this is totally out of historical precedence because Biden was expected to be shellacked. And yet, again, he has defied us. He has defied us. I don't know if that's correct in the Philippines, but as an American term. But he once again defied us, right? Like everyone tends to underestimate Biden. And then Uncle Joe, comes from out of nowhere and defies the odds. He has done better than all Democratic presidents in their first term, probably since JFK, right? So this is quite something.
But going back to Danny's question, kanina, let's say the Republicans have control of the House, and maybe we don't know yet for the Senate. If at all, you'll probably have an almost 50-50 thing. Very, very small margin. What about us for next 2 years? How does that affect us?
So, para sa akin naman, negative impact sa Pilipinas at ibang bansa na aliado ng Amerika if dysfunctional yung politics or the dysfunctionality actually gets worse. So what I'm going to watch for is yung mga super extremists or pro-Trumpers, what kind of committee positions they're going to get. Because now they're going to be the majority almost certainly in the Congress, in the lower house. I'm not sure about the Senate. So what these people will do with that newfound power is important. Are they going to be just there to embarrass the Democrats, embroil the country in the crisis? Because remember in 2013, Obama could not go to Asia for the trips in ASEAN and all. He had to cancel it because of the deadlock over the budget issue. There was a shutdown of the government. So may direct implication yan. So kung I don't know. If there's dysfunction in America, I wanted to use a Tagalog term, but I thought it's not PC. If dysfunction in America directly affected tayo. But also, who becomes the American president, if he's powerful, he's in a position to help us better. But if he's bogged down internally, his ability to help us is going to be also compromised. Aliado tayo in America, so it also matters to us what happens domestically in America. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have more of Richard Heydarian in the next program, so
and on
watch
the
out for
Chiefs.
him. Maraming salamat, Richard Heydarian. Thank you for joining us tonight.
You.
And more stories after the break, so keep it here in One News. You're still watching the big story here in One News. At least 120 unclaimed corpses of believed inmates are now up for autopsy. Bucor OIC Gregorio Catapang says it's possible that their deaths were deliberately not disclosed to the relatives. Camille Samonte with the story.
Over 100 cadavers of inmates from the new Bilibid prison will be turned over to the UP College of Medicine. Justice Chief Boying Remuel said the remains will be subject to autopsy. They will be examined by Dr. Raquel Fortun, the one who conducted the second autopsy on June Villamor, one of the alleged middlemen in the murder of broadcaster Percy Lapid.
We will try to locate the families first, ask for their permission, if possible. Kasi papa-autopsy muna natin, and then, if possible, just be used for the pursuit of science.
This came after authorities discovered some 176 unclaimed bodies at Eastern Funeral Homes in Muntinlupa. This is the same place where Villamor was brought to last month.
Part of mismanagement kasi bakit naman naipon ng ganung kadami na yung mga patay na hindi na iaparating sa mga kamag-anak.
Catapang added that it is also possible that these deaths were deliberately not disclosed to their next of kin.
Kasi nga dapat ipinapublish yan para na widest dissemination.
Pero hindi ito na-publish, sir.
Hindi nga, kasi nga nilihim o whatever, no? O walang sistema. Yun na, walang protocol .
Dr. Henry Fabro of the NBP hospital is now being investigated. Fabro is the one who conducted the initial examinations in the inmates' bodies. Meanwhile, at least 10 of 176 unclaimed bodies of inmates have been buried at the NBP cemetery. They died from illnesses including respiratory and heart failure. Authorities said their bodies may be exhumed if their families wish to have them examined. For News 5, Camille Samonte, We Are One News.
And that's the big story tonight. For more updates, follow News 5, The Philippine Star, and Business World Online. You may also log on to onenews.ph for more in-depth analysis. I'm Ed Lingao.
The big story is also available via Signal Play app. Make a free account now. That's at signalplay.com and stream One News anytime, anywhere. I'm Danny Laurel. Stay safe, Philippines.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.